So I'll talk about debt overhang and fiscal policy, and there are basically two broad things I'm going to do here. I'm going to show you some data, and then towards the end, I'm going to talk about stuff that might sound a bit unorthodox, but we are at INET, so I think we're supposed to say a few things which are unorthodox, and I'll try to give my share. Some of the things I'll talk about at the end in terms of possible prescriptions, I'm saying it for the first time, so you'll actually be doing me a favor if you think I'm making no sense, okay? So I will then not say them again. So just feel free to criticize if you don't like what I'm saying towards the end. So let me, the strict outline of what I'm going to go through, there are basically kind of three parts. First, I'm going to show you data to justify why we need to do anything. When someone says fiscal policy, monetary, whatever, I mean, why do we need to do anything to begin with? And I'm going to try to show you data on what is the key problem or constraint that we are trying to address here, just to narrow and focus down the conversation of what needs to be done here. But I think that's very relevant, because any policy that we come to afterwards needs to tell us this is the constraint, and this is how this policy is going to solve that constraint. So we need to be more narrow and focused in our conversation. It's not about sharing ideologies. Then I'll talk to the fiscal policy side and say, how does the fiscal policy actually address these constraints? And the answer is going to be, it's not necessarily the case that any fiscal policy is going to address those constraints. It has to be a specifically tailor-made fiscal policy that can potentially target those constraints. And that's where I'll talk about perhaps some of the unorthodox stuff that I mentioned earlier. And finally, I'll talk about, if everything can be laid out in a few slides, why are we not going there? And I think that's a very important question to think about, both in the short run and also in terms of long-run regulation slash policy debate of how we should be running ourselves and the world. Okay. So now the first point, why do we need any intervention to begin with? And the key argument here is that we are living in a world that has millions upon millions of debt overhang consumers, which leads to a market failure. Okay? And I'm going to show you, not just argue theoretically, but I'm going to show you how powerful this is showing up in the data. Okay? But here's the basic story. The basic story is a game or a trade-off between creditors and debtors. And so you can think of that as Greece versus Germany in the international context, or you can think of that as levered versus unlevered households within the US or any other country for that matter. So here's the basic story. Okay? The basic story is there's an unexpected sharp fall in the net worth of indebted households, which is the house price drop. That in turn forces the indebted households to cut consumption dramatically, because now they're underwater and they have to reevaluate, reoptimize their future plans. But that's just half of the story. For every debtor, there is a creditor, of course. Perhaps the creditor households increase their consumptions because interest rates are going to fall. But what if they don't? They have a choice after all. What if they refuse? What if they're not sensitive much to interest rate drops? Well, then you get a zero lower bound problem and a fall in aggregate demand. Okay? Which then, because aggregate demand equals aggregate output, and so you have a reduction in employment and you have a recession. That's where we are. This is the theoretical argument. Let me show you how strong this is in the data. We have no reason to doubt this anymore. That's how strongly I would make the case. The data for the US is coming from my own work with Amir Sufi and some with Kamalesh Rao. And the cross-country data is just very new. Just, I think in the last week, a news study came out by the IMF. It has some very nice plots. I'll show you one of those. Okay, so the US evidence. Remember, it all begins with a shock, the unexpected shock. And here you're seeing the unexpected shock. What is the unexpected shock? It's the drop in house prices. But an important point here to understand is the drop in house prices is not uniform across the US. In particular, if you split the US counties into those which are the most levered ones by debt to income and those which are the least levered ones, you can see that the house price shock basically only shows up in the high leverage counties. This is data, I'm not making this up. This is a big shock. We think as if it's a uniform shock, it's not. Okay. Then the next issue I want to address is, how do these people, the high levered county people, how are they reacting to this shock? Now remember the story I gave you up front. They'll start cutting back on consumption. And as they cut back on consumption, the question is, what are these? These are the creditors, the unlevered guys. How do these respond when these guys are cutting back? Because obviously interest rates are falling dramatically, at least to the extent the Fed has control over them. How do these people respond to those cuts? Those are the aggregate demand consequences. So let's look at what happens. We can measure consumption in different ways. This one is measuring consumption via new automobile purchases. And what you can see is the high-levered counties, those are the blue here. I may be switching colors around, so I apologize for that. The blue guys are the high-levered ones. You can see they are cutting back on consumption, new automobile purchases dramatically. The other guys are not cutting back because they don't have a debt overhang problem. However, they don't increase towards the end. You're seeing a little bit of it, but actually, it doesn't really, it's not that it goes away. So they're not doing much. They're certainly not increasing. And you have an aggregate demand drop. We also have broader measures of consumption. This is through MasterCard data on stuff people are buying on their credit cards and so on. And you can see the same effect very clearly on durable expenditure, much stronger drop among high leverage. And the low leverage is not compensating at all. Similarly, for non-durable, non-grocery, and you even see it for groceries, which people should be least sensitive to because they are your everyday items.
The auto sales, wasn't that period in 2009, 2010 when the federal government was giving a rebate?
Yeah, cash.
Yeah, so that probably explains that upward movement.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
As I said, that's not important, so don't pay too much. Yeah, cash flow. I can talk more. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So and that also tells you, by the way, that program was wrongly designed because it's all showing up in the wrong places. So that's the story on aggregate demand. And in fact, it has very strong employment consequences. Let me show you that. But before I show you that picture, there is one problem in linking demand with employment, which is when we buy stuff, that stuff is produced everywhere, right? So as an empiricist, how do you track employment consequences? Well, the answer is you look at non-tradables first, because that effect will show up in your area. The effect on tradables will show up everywhere. So when Greeks suffers, when the Greeks suffer, Germany will suffer as well because they buy some of German products. So here's the evidence on that. Again, as I said, I apologize for switching colors, but this is the high leverage counties. And now I'm showing you data on non-tradable employment first. What is non-tradable employment? Is food, restaurants, just think of that. That's non-tradable. A much sharper drop in non-tradable employment in the high leverage counties, the debt overhang consumer counties. And I've already shown you they're cutting back drastically on consumption. And this is the employment consequence of that. In low leverage, we don't see as much of a drop. Okay, this is the non-tradable employment. What about tradable employment? It drops everywhere, as you would expect. This is our, the common universe we live in, globalization, whatever you want to call it. We are all in this together. Even if you live here, you say, okay, why do I care about it? Well, this is why we need to care about it. So this is the data, and I think it's very strong. It's hard to argue against it. This is the world we are living in. It's a world of zero lower bound. It's a world of aggregate demand collapse. And now we must need to put our heads together and say, okay, what can we do about this? Oh, by the way, we are outside the US. So let me show you, this is not just a US phenomena. This is the IMF report I was talking about. If you rank countries on leverage, and in particular, if you rank countries on the increase in debt-to-income ratio over this boom period, it lines up exactly as I was showing you the cross-country pattern, the cross-county pattern within the US. Increase in leverage, that's where you see the sharpest decline in consumption. Okay? So it's the same story, actually. Greece versus Germany is the same story as, Dallas, Texas versus Florida or the Bay Area in the US. So what can we do? As I've already said, the data are very clear on that. Okay? So let's think about the policy consequences for this. And in particular, let's think about fiscal policy, because that's what this panel is about. Fiscal policy, there are two parts of fiscal policy, right? How or where to spend, but we want to be careful. We want, obviously, anything you spend, you need to raise revenues either today or tomorrow. So we also need to think a little bit carefully about how we are going to raise revenue. The stuff that I've shown you, I think, has implications for both of these questions. It tells us how we should be spending, but it also tells us something we don't much talk about, how we should be raising that revenue. And that's where I'm going to be a little bit more unorthodox. So feel free to shut me up if you don't agree with me. As I said, you'll be doing me a favor. So let's think of the implications of debt overhang consumer for fiscal policy, and in particular for these two questions, how to spend and how to raise revenue. Let's first think of how to spend. It's very obvious once you know the data. What we really need to do is we need to solve the debt overhang problem, which means we need to facilitate debt reduction. Okay? That's the basic point. And I think it's important that we make that basic point clearly, because we can't beat around the bush anymore. That's what we're talking about. There are different ways to do this. In fact, there are some ways to do this that are revenue neutral. If you really think about it, it doesn't have to be a fiscal issue. We're talking about a redistribution, and that's what it is. We are talking about redistribution between creditors and debtors given the aggregate situation. Let's just call it that. It's politically not the nicest thing to say, but that's the reality of the situation. And I've already said, we are all in this together. So I don't have to be a debtor to really push for debt reduction. It's affecting all of us. That's the externality. There are different ways to do this, and some are revenue neutral. That's the redistribution point. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you one example. In 2005, the Congress passed what was called the BABCA regulation, bankruptcy and so on. It made it harder for people to get out of debt. It increased recourse that creditors had to the debtors. Exactly the worst thing to do before such an event happens. Why can we not reverse that? You know, if banks are playing hardball, it's time to return the favor. Why can we not make it, reduce the propensity of them to have recourse, basically? Say, okay, the only recourse you have is to the property. You'll automatically have principal write-downs for underwater homeowners.
I can't help but interject. The reason why that bill was passed, because we'd had a huge increase in credit card debt from the banks pushing credit card debt, so they were having larger amount of default. So this was their answer. Yeah.
Exactly, right? But we want to, we talk about moral hazard, we want to discipline both creditors and borrowers. If you give enormous amount of recourse to creditors, who is going to discipline creditors on the upside, on the boom side? So I think regardless of how you look at this situation, we are in a world which is not balanced anymore. We need to, I totally understand the question of moral hazard, but there is moral hazard on both sides, and we need to draw the middle line here. Similarly, in this, when it's an aggregate shock, you have fire sales, whether it's a short sale or whether it's a foreclosure, it's a fire sale. We can't afford it. It has its own externality. And so debt reduction, principal write-downs is the optimal solution. Refinancing, all this talk of refinancing, it's trivial. You look at the numbers, 1% lower, I mean, it's trivial amounts given the magnitude. You need to write down $1 trillion or more. That's just the basic numbers. The household sector in the US accumulated $7 trillion in 5 to 6 years, despite any aggregate increase in income for these households that were borrowing. So we need to look at the numbers before we support one policy strongly. And then while you're doing that, you want to make sure that this cutback in consumption is not hampering long-run growth, which means you want to make sure that people are able to pay for basic child health education and things like that while we are going through this transition period. So that's my quick speech on the spending side, okay? And parts of it may be controversial, but I think the more controversial part comes in when you think of how we need to raise revenue for this expenditure that we are doing. Some of it is going to come back, right? That's one of the reasons why this is a collective problem, because some of it we are going to come back. It may not be the banks getting it back, but we will get it back as a society, and it's time we think like that, as opposed to from a bank balance sheet perspective. How to tax? Now, I do believe income taxes are distortionary, and so we need to be careful ramping them up too high, especially when you want to add more incentives for value addition. So how do we think of generating revenue? That's where I'm going to be a bit unorthodox. Why not think about taxing wealth? But I'm not talking about all kinds of wealth. How about taxing debt or holdings of bonds? okay? And a few, because the scale is big, a few basis points might do the trick. In fact, if you think of the problem, this is going to solve both of our problems. We are going to raise revenue, and we'll be doing what is basically the problem. It is a problem of redistribution between creditors and debtors. Let's be explicit about it. Let's raise it through taxes. It also solves the other problem, because the zero lower bound is telling us the people who are holding bonds are saving too much. We are trying to convince them to spend. That's the other way to solve this problem. So let's tax them a little bit. So it pinches them a little bit harder, basically gives you negative interest rates. And now you tell them you either spend, or if you want to keep it, we'll take part of it and give it to your debtors. Okay, you don't have, well, that's basically what we're doing. So we raise revenue for fiscal support and attack the zero lower bound problem at the same time. But we have to think out of the box. Income is not the only thing we can tax. The government can tax anything. It taxes my house. Why can't it tax other people's wealth? So that's it. That's the solution, right? In the end, let me just say, why do we have to have so many conferences to make these points? And I think that's the political problem, because as I said, this is about redistribution. And that's where everyone pulls up their defenses and they start lobbying back and forth. In fact, if you look at data, so I've done some work with Francesco Trebbi and Amir Sufi on this historically. It shows up in the data as well. When you look at the political ramifications of these kind of Rogoff-Reinhardt kind of crises, you see an effect which is the politics becomes more polarized actually, and more fractionalized. There's more Tea Parties and so on, and the Occupy Wall Street movements on kind of opposite sides, which means it's because of this redistributive battle now becomes much starker. But it has another consequence, which is this is the worst time to try to form a consensus. You'll be unlikely to be successful. That's the unfortunate situation we are in. The politics becomes more fractionized, so it becomes harder to actually, we can all agree in this room perhaps, but we will not be able to agree in the halls of Congress. So here's my last unorthodox statement perhaps. The long run, and we keep coming back to these problems, right? This is not the first time we are having it. We keep coming back to this problem. So the solution needs to incorporate all of these political feasibility of these proposals. We can't say, okay, if there is a crisis, we'll do fiscal stimulus. We won't be able to, most likely. So we have to solve this problem, not ex post, but ex ante. This is a long run issue. So what's the problem ex ante? The problem or what's the solution ex ante? The solution ex ante is that we need to put in our financial contracts a contingency for these kind of events upfront, so it's automatically taken care of, which is to say reduce recourse, for example, right? And put in explicit aggregate contingencies. So move away from non-contingent debt towards contingent debt. So one example is mortgages, and we have the technology now. We can write mortgages on the aggregate house price index or the local house price index. So that aggregate risk is being shared between creditors and borrowers. Why can't we do that? There is no moral hazard there. The borrower is not it's not in the individual's control what happens at the city level. If we had that contract, most of these problems would never arise in the first place, because you'll have an automatic deleveraging given the, it should be priced up front, and so it will be priced up front. That's the market solution to this. So I think long run, we want to move in this direction. Short run, we need to think of the kind of fiscal policy that I suggested. That's my 2 cents worth. Thank you very much.